The $100,000 lie. Why your mortgage is secretly bankrupting you. English script. Picture this. A 34-year-old man stands in his own kitchen, holding a mug of coffee that's gone cold, staring at a wall he technically owns. Somewhere beneath his feet, bolted into the foundation of that house, is $140,000 of his own money. Not invested, not growing, not working for him in any measurable way. Just sitting there, frozen like a corpse in permafrost. He calls himself a homeowner. But if you strip away the title, the deed, the framed photo of the closing day handshake, what he actually is a man who voluntarily buried his own liquidity 6 feet under a roof. And he did it because somewhere, at some point, someone convinced him that rent was the enemy. That every dollar handed to a landlord was a dollar thrown into a furnace. Nobody ever told him that the furnace has 2 doors. Because right now, this exact moment, the bank he owes money to is running its own quiet furnace. And he's the one feeding it. Let's talk about the greatest financial magic trick of the last 100 years. The trick where an entire culture was taught that debt is an asset, that a liability wearing a nice roof is somehow the same thing as wealth. Stick around, because by the end of this, you're going to look at your own mortgage statement completely differently. Here is the sleight of hand nobody explains in the beginning. In the first years of a 30-year mortgage, the overwhelming majority of your monthly payment isn't building equity at all. It's interest. Pure, unrecoverable, gone forever interest. Pull up an amortization schedule sometime if you have the stomach for it. On a typical loan, you could be paying $3,000 a month and watching maybe $400 of it actually chip away at the principal. The other $2,600 evaporates into the bank's income statement. That's not a mortgage payment. That's rent. You are renting money from an institution, and the institution is charging you for the privilege of calling yourself an owner. Now stack property taxes on top of that. A bill the government never stops sending, no matter how paid off your house becomes. Add insurance premiums that, thanks to climate volatility, are now rising faster than almost any other household cost in America. Add maintenance, the quiet 1 to 2% a year tax nobody budgets for until the water heater dies at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Add the brutal reality that selling a home can devour up to 10% of its value in fees and commissions. When you total it all up, the so-called unrecoverable costs of owning frequently land at or above the cost of simply renting the same square footage. You didn't escape the landlord. You just diversified him into a bank, a county assessor, and a roofing contractor. But here's where it gets genuinely dark, because interest and taxes are just the surface wound. The real damage happens somewhere nobody's looking: your down payment. Say you put $100,000 down on a $500,000 house. That money didn't disappear, but it might as well have. It's now dead capital, locked inside drywall and shingles, incapable of compounding, incapable of paying you a dividend, incapable of being touched without selling the entire asset around it. Meanwhile, if that same 100,000 had been dropped into a broad market index instead, historically compounding around 10% a year, it would roughly double every 7 years. Not because the stock market is magic, but because liquidity has value and diversification has value, and your house is neither liquid nor diversified. It's a single, illiquid, highly leveraged bet on one specific zip code. Nobel laureate economist Robert Shiller spent decades proving something the entire real estate industry would rather you never hear. Over the last century, inflation-adjusted home prices have barely outpaced inflation itself. The dramatic wealth stories you hear at dinner parties are almost always either inflation wearing a disguise or leveraged luck in a handful of specific bubble decades in specific bubble cities. That survivorship bias with a white picket fence. So how do you actually know when buying makes sense versus when it's a trap dressed up as tradition? There's one number the industry prays you never calculate: the price-to-rent ratio. Take the price of a home, divide it by what it would cost to rent an equivalent property for a year. A ratio under 15 historically favors buying. Above 20, the math is screaming at you to rent. And right now, in cities like San Francisco, New York, Toronto, and Sydney, that ratio is sailing past 25, sometimes 30. When the number gets that extreme, renting isn't the consolation prize. Renting is the arbitrage. You're occupying $1 million asset for a fraction of what it would cost to actually finance it, while the owner absorbs every ounce of risk. The market downturn, the cracked foundation, the failed furnace. You get the shelter. They get the exposure. That's not settling. That's shorting an overpriced market and getting paid inconvenience. And then there's the cost nobody puts on a spreadsheet at all: mobility. In an economy where job security is a myth and opportunity moves faster than any 30-year fixed rate, your house is an anchor chain to the ocean floor. A renter gets a better offer in another city, gives 30 days notice, and walks. A homeowner has to stage, list, negotiate, pay 6% to agents, absorb closing costs, and pray the market hasn't turned against them since closing day. People have watched a decade of equity evaporate in a single bad selling season because they were forced to move at the wrong moment. You're not just buying a house when you sign that mortgage. You are shorting your own future flexibility, and in a volatile economy, flexibility might be the single most underpriced asset there is. Now, somebody in the comments is already typing the rebuttal, but rent goes up every year, my mortgage payment is locked. True. That's the strongest argument in the entire pro-buying case, and it deserves respect. A fixed-rate mortgage really is a hedge against inflation on that one line item. But notice the wording, one line item. Because taxes climb, insurance climbs dramatically in half the country right now. Maintenance costs climb with the price of lumber and labor. You didn't escape inflation. You just rearranged which door it walks through. Meanwhile, a disciplined renter investing the gap between rent and the true cost of ownership is watching that portfolio compound at historical rates that outpace rent increases most years. The spreadsheet almost always favors the renter who actually invests the difference instead of the one who lets it evaporate on a lifestyle upgrade. None of this means never buy a house. If you're planting roots for a decade or more, if the local price-to-rent ratio genuinely favors ownership, if you value customization over liquidity with your eyes wide open, buying can be the right call. But that's a decision made with a calculator, not with shame. The shame is the real enemy here. The quiet, culturally engineered guilt that convinces a 30-year-old renting a one-bedroom that they've failed some invisible test of adulthood, while their homeowner friend is one property tax reassessment away from a panic attack. Wealth was never about the deed in the drawer. It was always about owning things that pay you, dividends, cash flow, equity that compounds without a roof leaking on it. A house is something you pay. An asset is something that pays you. Confuse the two, and you can spend 30 years building someone else's fortune while calling it your own. So look at the number. Run your city's price-to-rent ratio. Calculate the real, unrecoverable cost of what you're paying versus what you'd pay to rent the same square footage. And if the math says rent, then rent without a shred of guilt, invest the difference, and let somebody else lie awake worrying about the roof.